Hi everyone, and welcome to the Tribbler podcast. This is the second episode of the show, and the atmosphere today is quite different. In the studio, I'm with the most special guest, I could say. Roscoe Palm is the director of the Pan-African Institute for Socialism. Roscoe, I welcome you to the Tribbler podcast. I think you can just do a little bit of introduction about yourself. I might have missed some of the details.
I'm Roscoe Palm. It's good to be with you today. I'm here because you asked me to, and especially after having watched your interview with Dr. Hans last week, which I highly recommend everybody go and watch.
Okay, thanks for that.
I'm a Pan-Africanist. I'm a socialist. I'm a City of Cape Town councillor.
Okay.
And today I'm just a fan of yours.
It's amazing to have someone like you, especially from someone like me. I feel honored because I think I'm sitting with one of the first people to be enrolled at the white school during apartheid.
Yes, that was in 1990 at the when it became no longer sustainable for the National Party government to maintain the apartheid anymore. They had to break down those walls of segregation. And many people from black and colored communities were allowed to then access the superior education that had been reserved for white people.
Okay.
And I was among the first non-white people to experience the position of enormous privilege that white society had kept unto itself in apartheid. And those differences between the worlds were so stark that it informed my politics in a way that was, even as a 10-year-old, it fundamentally changed all of us in that generation. Either we were put into a space of denial of being so not being able to see the inequality that's right before us, or we'd be so radicalized to the extent where we'd see that this is an injustice, and it continues to be. Okay. And I was in the latter category when I saw the stuff and having to assimilate myself and diminish my my culture and my race and my identity to assimilate into white culture, where even one would deny one's identity and heritage to fit in. So it was a very powerful experience, and that informed the rest of my politics for me to become the person who's sitting in front of you today.
So we could say that was your foundation of the political career.
Fundamentally.
Okay, that's amazing. I like the fact that you are a Pan-Africanist who is also a socialist. First of all, I need us to get something. I need to understand what is an African, because before we jump into what is Pan-Africanism or socialism, I need us to get the foundation of what exactly is an African, what defines an African.
I think if you ask 50 different people who are African to define what an African is, you'd get 50 different answers. So for me to be an African, one has to, one of the things that you can say is that one has to be born on the continent to be an African. And I think that's a very narrow definition, because it excludes 400 years of colonialism, slavery, and it also excludes the African diaspora. Our brothers and our sisters in the Caribbean were put there as a result of the slave trade. They are no less African than any of us. Okay. And if you look at recently the debate between Israel Adesanya and Dricus.
Yeah.
The whole thing became about identity. Who is an African? Dricus born in Africa, Israel born in New Zealand. So there is no answer, no clear-cut answer to that. For me, I consider both of them to be African. No more, no less than the other.
Okay. I think I was one of those people who have been misinformed about what an African is or what defines an African. Growing up, I remember whenever I see a black color, to me that's an African. And when I see either colored Indian or white, I could say, no, you're not an African. So I had this idea of Africa being only for black people. Up until maybe 3 months ago when I did my research so well, I realized that it's a complex issue and it's a complex topic that needs some in-depth. So we can conclude that an African is not identified by race or by language or either skin color. It can be someone who was born in Africa or someone who have maybe ancestry in Africa. So do you really agree that 1652 when the first British, is it not British or Dutch settlers
Dutch, yes,
came to Cape Town, from the 16th century up to today, do you think it's fair not to call them Africans, or do you think it's fair to call them Africans?
Look, I have to acknowledge that my experience as an African is hugely different from somebody who is a black person in Africa, especially here in Cape Town in South Africa, where myself as a colored person, historically we were afforded different privileges as to let's say black Africans. I'm no less African, but my experience, how I experience my Africanness, the political lens through which my identity was diffused or magnified according to the convenience of the moment. That's where I think people part ways on who is an African, what defines Africanness. And I'm no less of an African than somebody living in Accra or Bulawayo or Kwamashu. But my lens through which my experience as an African differs vastly from other people who, in these areas. And the fault of that doesn't lie with Africans themselves. The fault of that lies with colonialism, slavery, apartheid, these things which segmented us into different subcategories of African, to the extent that it relegated us to being subhuman underneath those who colonized, exploited, and extracted from us and our continent.
Okay. I like what you've explained, but if you go back, how far can we go back in history to say this one is an authentic African or this one is the pure African? Because if you check from the east of or west of Africa during the 17th century, that's where we see the arrival of the Arabs in Africa. So those states, even today, they don't identify as African, most of them. Maybe Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia, and other Islamic states. I'm still confused as to what can we call an African, because we have people or a group of people who are on the landmass of Africa, but those people, they don't want actually to identify as an African. So I'm still lost with the identity of what actually is an African. Is it race? Is it geographical location? Or it's something else? I'm still confused.
I think it's designed to be confusing. I mean, are we defining Africa and Africans politically? Are we defining them by melanin content? Are we defining them by political sensibilities? And that's something that I think we're grappling with. Africa has been such a contested space for so long. We've had colonial masters, neo-colonial masters, capitalist masters. We've had friends and allies, and we've had enemies and subjugators from all corners of the globe. So I think that you are right in the sense that is the pertinent question when we talk about Pan-Africanism, like defining what is African. But the important thing is not to look at, for me, not to look at, or rather to weigh the question so heavily in the considerations and of the past, even though this is important. The real question is, where are we going as a continent, as a people? While acknowledging what was inflicted upon us and what we have in many ways inflicted on ourselves in certain scenarios.
So where I find a bit of misunderstanding with most Pan-Africanists is we are pushing Africa to be only for Africans, right? We are pushing the African agenda, maybe in terms of controlling the capital and redistribution of wealth and giving back to the poor people who have been subjugated and who have been slaves during slavery and then who have been colonized. I'm still stuck as to when we Pan-Africanists say they are pushing for Africa for Africans. If we cannot actually identify who is an African, then how can we push for the Pan-Africanist movement if we don't actually have what we can identify as an African? Then how can we push the idea of Pan-Africanism?
Look, I think if we reduce it to who,
Okay.
naturally then that would exclude people who may consider themselves and have much to contribute to African and Pan-Africanist thought,
Okay.
and charting a way forward for us. The important word when we speak about Pan-Africanism is the word sovereignty.
Okay.
So Africa and African countries could never describe themselves as being sovereign states completely. And even now, there's a competition for resources and a competition for influence, soft power in Africa. So in the past, for example, we saw Pan-Africanism. It is an incredibly dangerous idea to capitalism. Pan-Africanism necessarily dictates to unite against outside influence that would subvert our sovereignty. In the Cold War era, when there was a geopolitical competition between the United States and the Soviet Socialist Republic, Russia, the US saw Pan-Africanism as a threat to its power.
Okay.
So it would assassinate African leaders, it would coup African leaders who would make common cause with other Africans. America saw this as a communist threat. And as such, these leaders who espoused Pan-Africanism as a political ideal that seeks the sovereignty and the independence of Africans who had only just been, we were talking about the 1960s, the first African country to gain sovereignty from colonialism had only just been granted independence not long before Kwame Nkrumah, who I consider to be one of the godfathers of Pan-Africanism, was exiled and then couped and then died in very mysterious circumstances.
Okay. Can you allow me just to step in here? When we say Africa was once colonized, and we acknowledge that we were colonized at one point, so we do have people who had colonized Africa, and after independence, those people who have colonized Africa are still in Africa and identify as Africans. So when you're pushing for the agenda of Pan-Africanism, is it excluding the same people who are colonizers, or it is also including them in the Pan-African movement?
I think that anybody who is here or anywhere who wants to build African sovereignty and ensure that we are not a pawn in another geopolitical contestation between East and West, I would consider them to be a friend of Africa and an African. The extraction, and you're right, we are still colonized. Recently, in West Africa, we see the French being kicked out of the Sahel region as a result of colonialism that continues to this day. In West Africa, there is this device called the CFA franc. Those countries that were colonized by France made sure that these countries were economically subservient to it and answerable to France in Francophone Africa. They created this device called the CFA franc. It is a currency, or rather more than a currency. France determines the value of that currency, how much of that currency is allowed to be printed, and those African countries in the Sahel would then be it would be easier for them to trade with France than it would be to trade with any other partner. So their economic prospects were limited to effectively rendering African resources, and France has a massive nuclear power industry, where it's building and servicing nuclear technology all over the world. It needs those resources from the Sahel. When recently there's been a sea change in that region, these countries are being told France is being told to get out of these countries, and they're being expelled from these countries because of the colonialism, the economic colonialism that continues to this day. So, to cut the long story short, again, it comes down to sovereignty. It comes down to what is in Africa's best interest, and for Africans to have the agency to determine their own path.
Okay. It seems like we are on the same path, maybe. So we are saying the French who are in Niger or maybe whatever country today, they once came with colonialism, and after independence, they were given maybe citizenship of Niger or Burkina Faso, and those people were perpetuating the colonial systems, and they were benefiting France.
Yes,
but it subjugated the masses of those countries.
Yes,
and those people who were left by the colonial French system identifies as Africans or as Burkina Fasos or as Nigerians. Is it then fair to include those people when we push for the agenda of Pan-Africanism?
Oh, absolutely.
Or
in terms of the people of West Africa?
Yeah, I'm talking of, if we say those people who were left with colonialism, like the French nationals in Niger, and they identify as Africans, and we say Pan-Africanism is for Africans, because how far can we go back? So I'm saying, will it be fair for a national of Niger or an indigenous person of that country to be regarded, to be in the same box with a French national who is also perpetuating the colonial systems in them, to be on the same page, and we say we are fighting for them to be equal or to be at par?
If just to be clear, if somebody is wants, or rather has a preference for the regime of France within Africa, just to clarify the question.
So I'm saying the French nationals who were in Niger or Burkina Faso,
yes,
they identified as the locals or Africans.
Right. So they were born in Niger.
Okay.
But they, just to clarify, but they Africans on paper.
Yeah, they were born in Niger,
yes,
but their
simping France.
From France, and they are perpetuating the colonial systems which were left.
I don't consider them Africans.
So that's why I'm saying. Then we can have a hard time trying to define then who is an African and what is an African. I think.
Let me just clarify what I said about. I don't they are 100. They may be African.
Okay.
But they are not Pan-Africanists.
Okay.
They are the beneficiaries, the ongoing beneficiaries of colonialism and slavery.
Okay.
And this is antithetical to Pan-Africanism, African sovereignty, solidarity, and a constructive path forward to ensure that Africa no longer becomes the resource, the shared resource of everybody else except for Africans. There's this thing where the infrastructure of Africa, it's designed to run from where the resources are, the uranium, the gold, the diamonds, out towards the ports.
Okay.
The infrastructure, the rails, the roads that go out to the ports, airports, seaports, rail, they are so well maintained, in stark contrast to a road or a rail that's sitting right next door to that infrastructure which is built to bring things into the continent.
Okay, but Palm, I think that this is where my stumbling block is with Pan-Africanism. Egypt does not identify as an African country. It identifies as an Arabic country. Same as Morocco, same as maybe Tunisia and other Islamic states. So when we are fighting for Pan-Africanism or Africa for Africans, if it's not about color, about race, about the geographical location, then what is it about? Because can we include also Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia in the agenda of Pan-Africanism whereas they don't identify as Africans?
I don't think it's really fair to say that that the Arab countries don't identify as African. But you are right that there's a complex relationships inside of Africa. So the Egyptian ruler Nasser, essentially considered one of the fathers of the Pan-Arab movement, which I think it around about that time there were many movements that aimed to dismantle the system of colonialism, and the Arab countries, as much as the countries like Zimbabwe, DRC, like formerly Zaire, these are all I would say consequences of the same type of colonialism and exploitation. It doesn't matter that let's say Egypt and Moroccan leaders would identify more readily identify with their Arab brothers and sisters than they would with the sub-Saharan African brothers and sisters. I think that it's like
but my question is, will it be fair to try to force people to belong to a group where they don't belong, and also try to fight for them if they don't want to be included in the agenda?
I think there's a danger in lumping all Arabs together and saying that they don't consider themselves African. Okay. Yes, it's woven into the culture that they are come from a rich history of Arab culture, but similarly they are African brothers and sisters. Obviously Africa is so broad and so vast that it encompasses lots of people, lots of traditions, and I think between us and our Arab African brothers and sisters, there's a common thread of colonialism and exploitation and extraction. There's enough commonality, otherwise they wouldn't be in the African Union. For example. So I think if we distill it down to, let's say, some kind of crude race essentialism, that undercuts the fight for sovereignty, to be for Africa to be able to choose its own path and partners. Okay. Because we want to make the circle bigger. We don't want to say, isolate. Yeah, you there, Moroccans, you Nigerians. That's. I don't think that's really a path that. While we acknowledge our differences, and again, it comes back to what I said. The lens through which I view myself and my history, the same can be applied to national groups like Egyptians in relation to other groups. They are Africans, okay, but they have a different experience of being Africans.
Okay, I think we have covered this one. So now let's step into the Pan-Africanism, and what is Pan-Africanism, and what is its agenda, and how does it seek to transform Africa? I've asked Dr. Hans this question, and I was still hanged. I didn't get the clear answer that convinces me to say, okay, this is Pan-Africanism and this can be achieved. So maybe you can explore a bit about the Pan-African movement.
It's so multifaceted, and there have been so many great Pan-African thinkers and movements. I mean, you can say the Pan-Africanism of, let's say, or rather Marcus Garvey would differ not greatly, but, in some of its essential elements from the Pan-Africanism of Kwame Nkrumah, which would differ from, let's say, some from other thinkers in time. I can only give my definition of what Pan-Africanism not is, but what it means to me. Okay. And that would be for the Africans who have all had the experience of being in Africa, of Africa, and for Africa, whether they be in the diaspora or on the continent, to work for the sovereignty of this continent so that we can no longer be subject to the whims and the wishes of our former colonial masters. why don't we own, like the amount of land in Africa that's owned by, the Anglican Church, for example, they own vast tracts of land. Okay. The multinationals that are shipping all of our remember, this is what is ours must belong to us. We have the right to exploit.
Can I just jump in there?
Yes.
When you say our, what is ours? I think most Africans, we have the sense of entitlement. Where when we say our land or ours, what makes something ours, or what makes the land ours?
It's ours. You can't take it. It's immovable. And I would also say, I think let's say, for example, this MacBook. The resources that it takes, the fourth industrial revolution minerals it takes to in your phone or this MacBook, it is extracted in the harshest, cruelest, most barbaric conditions in artisanal mining. It is effectively slave labor.
Okay, but
we must be able to.
Do you agree that to own land in this modern day and age, you need to have title deeds? So is it fair to say because we were here during colonialism and we have been the indigenous people of the land, therefore we should own the land, or we have this land and we claim it to be ours simply because we existed before colonialism? Don't we need some form of title deeds to claim that we own the land, or we own the land simply because we were here before colonialism?
There were two very different approaches to, or rather philosophies about ownership. Okay. At the birth of capitalism, looking at kings and queens and feudal lords. There was land that was held in common. Okay. Everybody could graze there. We're talking about England now. This is before colonialism. Okay. Everybody could exploit the land for the benefit of the community. Nothing was held. There was no Roscoe owns this plot of land. He has a title deed, etc. Okay. Then this thing happened called enclosure, where the king and lords started to build fences, and they started to enclose land, and they declared. Again, the king is a very powerful person because this king or queen, they speak for God. Okay. Of course, and it's not, you're not going against the king, you're going against God. God says through his agent on earth that this land belongs to the king, so it belongs to God, and there's nothing you can do about it, and if you don't like it, we're going to kill you. Okay. The enclosure. So that was the philosophy or that informed how Europeans took our things. Similarly, when and my experience as a South African, when the Dutch, when the British came, they said, "Well, we found all this land and nobody owns it. We have the title deed," and they began the similar process of enclosure, and by force or by coercion or by deceit or by trickery, they would take this land. Because it belonged to nobody, that's what they said. But that's not true.
But when they come, was the land occupied?
Everybody.
Was the land occupied, or there were no inhabitants? I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone, but I think when they come, they find a land which was empty, and they inhabit the land. Unless we say they find people whom they killed, and then they take the land. But if they find an empty land, the same happened. People have been migrating. So if they migrate and they find a piece of land, definitely they would claim it to be theirs. The same as we did. People migrated all over Africa, and wherever they settled, they claimed to be their land. But should we go back in time and say simply because we were the people of the land, now we are saying this land mass was only one? But let's agree that Africa was diverse, and with the Igbos, we had the Shona, we had the Tswana, the Zulu, the Ndebeles, and all of them occupied their own lands, and they claim ownership to those lands. But time has passed now, and to have ownership to land, you need a title deed. So is it still a thing for Africans to say our land and claim ownership of a land without any title deeds?
It's our land.
Okay.
So that land didn't belong to nobody. It belonged to everybody.
Okay.
And just because nobody was exploiting it, occupying it at that particular point in time, it doesn't mean that enclosure of that land didn't do harm to anybody. Okay. And even within the framework of various tribes that were in certain geographical areas. I don't think you can say that, or not you personally, but anybody can say that, well, no one was using it, so it could be annexed. I mean, that is the most brutal violence that you can inflict on somebody to just be entitled to, like, no, you're not using it, it's mine.
Okay.
Because if that is the rule, if might is right, then what is stopping, let's say, for example, the South African government from telling all white people, or Indian, or whatever group that actually know that belongs to us now, and you just have to deal with it.
Because I think where my biggest worry is to say, because people came before colonialism, they find empty land, they occupy the land, but because they are of a certain color, they cannot claim ownership to the land. But you might see that there are other tribal groups whom you might find in South Africa and in Zimbabwe and in Zambia, Malawi. How did they get to that place and claim ownership to the land? Is it not the same thing that has happened with the Dutch and the British? You might agree it is the same way, but simply because of the different color, and we have this notion that Africa is for blacks. So if you're not black in Africa, you cannot claim ownership of land because you're not an indigenous person of Africa. So that's where I will come back and say, maybe people are right to say Africa is for Africans, which means blacks. Or maybe when we say...
coming back to Drickus, I think Africa is for Drickus too, and his family, and his children, and his community. Even the people on Oranje who deny that they're African, it's for them, they're born here, this is their soil, their land, their ancestors. The Afrikaans people were also, remember, they were also subject to colonialism.
Yeah.
In fact, the first people who were subject to a concentration camp were the Afrikaans people in 1899.
Okay.
The British enslaved, they put them in concentration camps, men, women, children, and they tortured them and they murdered them. That's where the Nazis got that idea from. They got that idea from the British, what they did to the Afrikaans people. Okay. So for anybody to say that a white Afrikaans person's blood hasn't been spilled on this soil, that they are African, I don't think that's fair. I don't think it's right.
I think it is our duty now to educate people out there that an African does not mean someone's skin color.
Yes. It is an emotional connection, and it is, it helps if you're born here. But somebody who's never set foot in Africa, who comes from America or the Caribbean, and their heart is here. Look at Dave Chappelle. Okay. He after he did the Chappelle show, he needed a break from the mental thing that he was under. Okay. He came home. He came to Africa to clear his head. He came to what he considered the motherland. However much or little he knew about the history and the politics, I don't know how much Dave Chappelle knows or doesn't know. Okay. But the point is, there was that connection, that there was that feeling that he belongs here. And anybody who feels that they belong here, that they have an interest in building Africa, I consider them an African. I may be wrong, or somebody else may have a different opinion.
I think that's my same opinion, that Africa is not determined by the skin color, or by geographical location.
Because I would resent not being called an African.
Okay, yeah.
I'm an African. What am I? I'm not an American. I'm not South American. I'm not European. I'm an African.
Yeah.
And Thabo Mbeki, his most famous speech, is his greatest contribution to the discourse. One of the greatest contributions to the discourse of any African politician is Thabo Mbeki's "I am an African" speech. Okay. Because it really resonated with people across the lines of nation, culture, creed, and language. It spoke to a broad section of people, and the results showed, because Thabo Mbeki, as the president of South Africa, he achieved, I think he got 70% of the vote, the ANC under Thabo Mbeki. And you can't do, now we look at the ANC, that 40%. You can't connect with people, Africans, unless you include them in your analysis and your view of history and politics and the story of Africa, unless you are honest and inclusive and redefining what it means to be an African beyond what you can see in the skin of another man or woman.
Okay, I think I've got a clear picture today of what an African is. On Pan-Africanism talks of uniting Africa both in the region and in the diaspora. I'm confused for sure to say what is an African in the diaspora.
Well, I mean, we have to acknowledge. Well, I saw a very interesting article today. King Charles, the British monarch, he's at the Commonwealth Heads of State movement, where I think there are about 50 Commonwealth countries, all the countries that the British crown had conquered and made them swear allegiance to in the Commonwealth. So now they're having this meeting. And one of the big discussions that they're having is the subject of reparations. Should the crimes against humanity perpetrated by the British be subject to a process of compensating the descendants of those who were wronged by colonialism and slavery? Okay. And we can't deny that there was definitely an enduring impact that colonialism and slavery has. So my brothers and sisters in the Caribbean, of course they are African. Also, when you're talking about colonialism and we're talking about the Commonwealth, who has set the terms for the relationship with the superpowers? It's always been Britain that has set the terms. They've said, no, we're not discussing this issue of reparations. Okay. And we're saying, no, we're closing the discussion about this. There's a scandal called Windrush in the UK where thousands of people from the Caribbean were given passage to the UK because they needed labor, they needed skills, teachers, etc.
Okay, but
let me just finish this. Okay. They were then denied their citizenship. Even their children were denied citizenship. And as recently as I think 5-7 years ago, all of these people who'd never known life in the Caribbean were deported to a land that they came from, that they'd never seen before in their lives. Okay. These people are African.
But what makes them Africans if they're not on the African continent? Because I think we can also go to the black people in America. They identify as African Americans to some degree. I don't know if that's what they call themselves. But if I remember well, the first slaves arrived in America in the 15th century. And from there, they've been in America. And they've lived there. That's the place that they've only known through their life. How then do they identify themselves as Africans? How far do we go back to history to say this is an African and this is not an African? Because if we say Pan-Africanism is pushing for Africans, but we are also trying to include some people who were by slavery, went into slavery, into another continent, maybe 6,000 years, not 6,000, maybe 600 years ago. And we try to include them as the Africans in diaspora. How do we balance that?
It comes down to, for me, sovereignty and agency. Their agency was taken away from them. They were removed from Africa and they were put elsewhere as though they were objects, as though they were implements, as though they were tools to further the industry of capitalists and colonialists. Okay. And these, Africans were not considered people. They were considered subhuman. A debt is owed to everybody who was removed from Africa. Okay. And whether they eschew that, whether they accept that, we're talking about Africans now. Okay. That's up to the individual to decide. But it's quite clear that historically, I mean, how do you define an African American as anyone other than somebody who was taken from Africa, stolen from Africa, and brought to America? Yeah, they are African American.
I'm still stuck, but okay then. So Pan-Africanism as a movement is advocating to unify Africa and the Africans in the diaspora. And you are also a socialist. And in socialism, we talk of redistribution of wealth and fairness and equality amongst all the people. Are you also saying we should include the diasporians and the locals, people in the region, when we talk of redistribution of wealth and equality?
I believe that every single person who was taken from Africa, stolen from Africa, their family, their descendants, are owed. They are owed money. You know, it's not the first.
Who owed them that money?
Do you know who at the end of slavery, there was a massive bailout. I'm not sure what the figures are, but a government bailout from the British Bank was given to people as reparations for the end of slavery. Those people were slave owners. They were compensated by the British government for the loss of their slaves. Okay. So if the British, and by the way, that debt was only fully repaid. The end of slavery, it was only fully repaid 7 years ago. Okay. So for hundreds of years, white slave owners had been bailed out by the British Crown for the loss of their slaves. Okay. So if you're going to apply one standard to white people, oh, sorry for your loss, you lost all your slaves, but you're not gonna even touch the purse. Huge wealth was built on the backs of black and slave labor. Money compounds over time. Interest, money sits in the bank. Money works. Industries are built. Commerce doesn't move, so commerce doesn't sleep. But somehow, black people and Africans are excluded from that particular calculation. I think black people who can demonstrate that they were victims of one of the most, if not the most heinous crimes against humanity, perpetrated over a century, even longer. Okay. They owed money.
Yeah, but I agree they are owed money, but who should pay them?
The British should pay them. The British should pay them.
Okay, that's a good one. The British must pay.
Yeah, the same people who paid the slave owners for the loss of their slaves should pay the slaves and the descendants of slaves, and I don't see why that shouldn't be the case.
Okay, socialism and Pan-Africanism, equality and redistribution of wealth. We have different classes of people, especially in South Africa. We have the minority who are the capital controllers and who owns the economy. And we have the middle class, maybe some rich blacks, and then we have the poor masses. Maybe majority of them are blacks.
Yes.
How are we going to redistribute wealth amongst all Africans?
I think we have to recognize that capitalism is a powerful tool. It can be used to do tremendous good in the world. But more often than not, because capitalists are so few in number and wield so much power and influence, it is self-serving, it is rapacious. So a socialist doesn't view the world that everybody must be equal. In terms of like, I must earn X amount, you must earn the same amount, we must all, that's not realistic. It's not going to happen. Like, sure, it would be great if we all earned 100,000 rand a month, the state, we all got that. But, there's the distribution of any resources is going to be uneven, it's a fact of life. But the control of the levers of capital and industry and the politics, it rests entirely with a small group of people. Very few of them are African. So if we look at how capital has extracted resources for the benefit of European agenda or the American agenda or to serve like imperial interests, look, I'm not saying that we mustn't be capitalists and we must, kill all billionaires or whatever the case may be. But let's start small. Let's say, for example, beneficiation. If you're taking a resource out of Africa, out of the mine, why can't we process that raw material here? Because the effect of that industry in processing that raw material as a multiplying effect of creating more value in that end product, it will lead to, let's say, for example, not creating MacBooks, but a MacBook factory. We can't just ship these things overseas and then somebody else accrues all the financial benefit. We have to advocate for a more equal partnership. And to countervail the worst instincts of capitalism, we have to make a stand and say, well, a socialist path would argue for, in this case, more beneficiation. We in Africa, we routinely elect leaders that are stupid, greedy, and corrupt. Same as any other government. But it's particularly bad in Africa, where we are subject to the whims of other people's and other nations' agendas. Let's say, for example, the conflict in Ukraine. We are seeing Africans being lobbied and being judged for not jumping in immediately and sending troops and equipment to Ukraine. And whenever there's a thing like, hey, they might be working with the Russians. So, we're being judged for not being the stooges of the West anymore, for looking after our own interests. And yes, say, for example, if there's a country that really feels that they should, get involved in the Ukraine crisis, for example, that's for them to do. And if the political leaders, that maybe they will suffer political consequences after the fact. But the expectation for us to be dragged from pillar to post in whatever conflict and geopolitical struggle that the West says Africans, it's best in Africa's interests, that this is the enemy, that these are friends, that's where sovereignty comes in. The sovereignty to be able to make our own decisions, to judge for ourselves what is, for the betterment of ordinary people in Africa.
I've got an issue with inclusivity of everyone. On the terms of global politics, you agree that the war in Congo has been going for maybe hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And in this current state, we know which country and which president is playing a part in the exploitation of the people of Rwanda. And when we try now to include those same people in the African agenda, in the Pan-African or socialistic environment, how are we going to transition from this current system whereby the global influence are also playing part in our regional politics? How then are we going to have a transition that can benefit all the people of Africa?
I think if we look at the causes, let's say, for example, the Rwanda genocide in 1997, that is purely a result of colonialism. Some person some colonialist took a pen and drew a line on a map. This is Rwanda, this is Burundi, with no sensitivities to the dynamics between, in this case, the Hutus and the Tutsis. Yeah. And it inflamed over years. It resulted in a situation eventually in 1997 where, it absolutely exploded. And we're not going to say that, I think the president that you are referring to in this example, yep, he was not around when the lines were drawn on the map. There are actors who exploit those situations of colonialism to advance their political agendas. But every single president in Africa is a billionaire.
Do you also agree that to perpetuate this exploitation in Congo, these countries are playing a part and their people are benefiting from the exploitation of the people of Rwanda, of the people of Congo?
Yes.
So is it actually practical to push for the African agenda that is going to unite all the nations to have the same agenda? At the same time, these countries, their allies, especially BRICS and the IMF and in the West, we have divisions. If you go to Zim in Zambia, they are brothers, like they are from one lineage,
Yes.
but they are separated because of the geopolitical. One is for the West and one is for the East.
Yes.
So, is it actually practical that we are going to have a socialistic, Pan-Africanistic continent anytime soon?
You know, I don't judge Hichilema, for example, in Zambia.
Yeah.
You know, there were huge problems with corruption in Zambia, and Hichilema, he ran as a reform candidate. There were, I mean, again, massive problems, similar to South Africa. Problems with distance from the masses, incompetence, greed, corruption, all of those things that effectively, you know, some people were running various parts of Zambia as it's though their kingdom. Hichilema came in and he instituted, I think, some reforms that were necessary and needed to stabilize the country, to stabilize the economy. But I think Hichilema is very smart because he understands that, you know, we don't only need to work with only the West, you know. Hichilema has never been, let's say, for example, anti-Chinese, you know, and he understands his political situation and the history of his country and the power structures in Zambia run along the grooves that are carved by the Kaundas. And he's not going to change that in the same way that you cannot change the shape of the Grand Canyon. These things were cut over time and they created this architecture, this political landscape that is not really going to, you cannot be made to shape it in the thing. So he understands how this thing works. So I don't think it's entirely fair to say like Hichilema or Zambia is completely West.
My point is to say, it's a fact Zambia and Zimbabwe are in conflict because of their allies in the global market. Also, Rwanda and Congo, they are in conflict because of their global allies. If you go to Zimbabwe and South Africa, they don't get along for some political reasons. I think there are a lot of examples of so many countries in Africa that are in conflict with each other, maybe it's because of their history or because of their global allies. Is it possible to achieve the socialistic or a communistic environment in Africa anytime soon?
I think there are, again, we referred to the Sahel, where at least there's some sort of anti-colonial kickback against the way that the French have exploited them there. You are right in the sense that I think our allies, would say for the allies, Zimbabweans, to use this example, I don't think it's as big a factor as saying that this is the number one thing affecting the relationship in those countries. But you are right. It is a small factor. But I would say that if you look at that situation, our relationship with each other as sovereign African nations cannot be dictated by the geopolitical interest and contestation of other countries. So if one country is, let's say, for example, leans towards the States, the US, and wants to, is more, has a better relationship with Western and European leaders, it doesn't mean that they are the blood enemy of a country that maybe has better relationships with, China, for example, But at the same time, again, it comes back to sovereignty, where we as African nations should look rather to what are the partnerships, rather than being dictated to along parochial terms. And when the US says, the US has largely abandoned Africa. Trump called it a shithole country. All through the 90s, the only focus on Africa came after 9/11, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center. Then the eyes of the West want Africa because, they viewed Africa as a potential partner in the fight against what the US defined as terrorism. Or, if left to our own devices, we would become basis for extremism and such like. So the West relationship with Africa has always been about threats to the West. Okay. It's never been about partnership. Okay. It's always been interventionist. And if you look at all through the, it was the CIA, it was the Americans who arrested Mandela. It was behind every single coup. It was the West. Okay. There's never been an example of, let's say, China creating a soft coup. Okay. But I'm not saying China is better than the West. I'm using this as an example to say that we should first that other countries would first seek partnership rather than to seek to be our parents. We reject that.
What's your take on the borderless Africa?
It's not possible. I would love it, but it's just not possible. I think that more trade and people should move more freely, but there is a thing that is out in the world now that when globalization started to take place in 1990 at the fall of the Berlin Wall, you saw the European Union being formed. You saw and then later NAFTA, and then the African Union, and then the NEPAD, which was driven by Thabo Mbeki, new partnership for African development. And then things started to change. Now we're the tide is going out again towards more isolationism. Make America great again. Put South African first. Incidents of racism, xenophobia, and Afrophobia. My definition of Afrophobia is, generally people who white people or colored people who are scared of black people from Africa. But I also believe that people, let's say in Zambia, can also be Afrophobic, can also be scared of people from the rest of Africa. As more competition for resources hots up, as austerity bites, as life becomes harder with in a contracting global economy, we're gonna direct our vitriol at the immediate aliens that we can see, not the alien tendencies that we cannot see. Those market forces, the forces of capitalism, the forces of sectarianism and division. It's easy to say, those Nigerians, they sell drugs, we must. Or even now in South Africa, where our Minister, Gayton McKenzie, Minister of Sports, says, we must close all the Somali shops. It's creating so much hate. The real enemy is scarcity of resources and austerity. It's not a Nigerian or a Somali or
is the problem mainly the lack of resources or the lack of productivity within the people of color? Because I think if you go to some places in South Africa, you might find that there is plenty of land that people are running from and they are migrating to come to the cities. I think it's the same with everywhere. People are running from rural areas where there's quality life, quality food, and maybe a better living as if you have to compare with their life in the city. Is the problem the lack of resources or productivity of the people of the land?
I don't think that we have a problem with people being productive. I think, of course, you're going to find people who are not productive. You're going to find people who are incredibly industrious. So the common factor is the lack of resources and the huge competition for a growing competition for fewer and fewer resources. So it kind of takes on this effect of being like crabs in a bucket. You see the one climbing over the other one and then the other one, but they're never really getting anywhere. There's no top of the bucket. You get to the top, the crab gets to the top of the bucket, and then another crab comes on top of him and pushes him down. And the bucket, my friend, is capitalism.
Okay.
The bucket is the legacy of colonialism and slavery and apartheid and all those things. So it's not about the industry or the laziness of the crab. The crab's trying their best. The problem is the bucket.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I disagree with that one. But you would agree that black people, or maybe, should I say black people, or I should say the minority, they're too comfortable to such a point that they are waiting to be given something by someone.
That's not true.
I don't think that
I disagree with that. 100%.
anyone with wealth or power or money is going to redistribute their wealth to anyone at any time
the
soon.
hardest working person in South Africa. You can say there's this myth that the richer you are, it must be because you worked hard. The hardest working person that you'll ever see in your life. There are millions of people like this. They're the people that live inside sea. They have to take 3 taxis. They have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. They have to take to go and clean people's toilets in Clifton or Plumstead or wherever the case may be. Then they leave at 4, and then they have to, they don't have the capacity or the time to see to their children. They're not lazy. It is hard work to be poor anywhere in South Africa. It's the hardest work you can do. It's easy to be a venture capitalist. If you have money to throw at the thing, if you've got $10 million, you throw $1 million at every venture. One of them will hit, one of them will 10x, one of them will 100x. It's easy work. So I just felt I wanted to jump in to sort of intercept that characterization.
Okay. I'm a socialist. I'm a communist. I don't agree with Pan-Africanism. I think people are well organized with small groups, because once you have the large number of people, that's where we have the herd mentality. Mm-hmm. So I believe there are 2 things or 3 that can bring change in Africa. The first one, we need some form of chaos, whatever it is, maybe hunger, maybe war, or whatever. Because whatever that the rich had, it did not come on a silver platter. It's either by exploitation or by war. So Africans who are waiting for wealth or a redistribution of wealth from anyone, it's not going to happen. Mm. So we need this form of chaos that will reset everything that we have in this current state and system. Once we have that chaos, we need a form of a political system that is a dictatorship. That is going to keep people in check, because human beings, sometimes they don't behave. In fact, in general, human beings tend not to behave and not to listen. So once we keep these people in check, we must also try and create some form of fiction or a form of a religion that is Afro-centered. Because we are forcing these people to obey, we should also allow them to think fictionally that they are free and they are making choices of their own. You would agree that Christians or maybe religious people, they don't commit certain crimes or they don't do bad things at certain times because they are scared of being watched with a God, or they are scared of being punished by God. So we should literally keep them in check, and we should create some form of fiction that they will think that they are morally right because they are doing something that is required by a supernatural being. I think the dictatorship, we get it from, where I get the idea of dictatorship is from Gaddafi.
Who was a Pan-African, by the way.
Yeah, so people would say he was a dictator, but who was benefiting? The people of Libya were beneficiaries. So we need that form of dictatorship, and Gaddafi has proved it, that it's possible. And if you go to Zimbabwe, Mugabe was a dictator. It was for the benefit of the people of the land. And when it comes to fiction, I think the perfect example will be Shepherd Bushiri, or this famous prophet from from Nigeria.
TB Joshua.
Yeah. They've proved that we can actually use, or we can manipulate a human mind, and it can function so well that it doesn't need to question. So to change the African agenda, to change the current political system and the social systems, I think we need those 2 things. That people can do something that we can say Africa is now getting to a better stage, And I think the last part that I can say, I said three things. The last one is to industrialize. We need an industrial revolution, which most of Africans are not ready for. For instance, we hate the exploitation of Congo, but at the same time, we are using iPhones.
Yeah.
We hate the West, we hate the Americans, but at the same time, we are using their products. Almost every African house is drinking Coke, and we are using Androids. If you go to maybe the middle class, the rich and the poor, I think both classes, the rich are buying the Louis Vuittons, the Gucci's, and all those fashionable or expensive brands. The middle class are buying Nikes, Adidas, all those brands. If you go to the poor, they can't afford those things, so their alternative is the Chinese fake goods. If you went to Bellevue, you will see this Somalian shop or this, I don't know, maybe Bangladesh. They're selling this fake counterfeit goods to the poor masses of Africa. So as long as we still have that mindset of trying to adopt or trying to be more Western than more being African, Africa is never going to industrialize. Our women are wearing, they call it frontal. And they have, a starter pack of an African woman today is a frontal wig, a makeup kit, and a handbag. And if you see those things, they portray an image of self-hate.
In terms of reflecting a Western view of consumerism and aspiring to that sort of thing that's not that's sort of that's an assimilated culture.
So I believe with those three pillars that I've said, we can actually take Africa far.
Okay.
So we need chaos, we need dictatorship, and we need
industrialization.
Yeah.
I have a lengthy response to this. Not lengthy, but okay. So I think so. I understand what you're saying in the sense that you want chaos to reign, to accelerate change, and there's a thinking behind this in the sense that people wanted, say for example, Donald Trump to win because that would accelerate change. Okay. You know, they want him to, they want, let's say, Russia to launch its nuclear weapons because in that chaos there's an opportunity for change, and I don't agree with that, because if you look at as the world as it is now, how much more chaos do we need, brother? You know? So okay, let me work through. So
is at peace right now. If you check the budgets of the armies or the budgets that are being spent on trying to fight war, they have been cut.
I think people in Lebanon and Gaza and on the West Bank and in Ukraine and in Sudan will disagree with you 100%. So, but let me get back to this thing let's say from that you are an accelerationist. You want catastrophe, which will lead to dictatorship, which will lead to industrialization. These first two steps are not necessary to get to the third step. Okay. We don't need permission to be for industrialization. We need better leaders. And a word on TB Joshua, and because I've got a lot to say about this guy.
Before you go to TB Joshua, do you think the people of Africa are ready for the industrial or the industrial revolution?
Yeah.
Of course
not.
Look,
we talk about the fourth industrial revolution. There are places, even in South Africa, that are waiting for the first industrial revolution to come to them.
Are the youth of today ready for the change?
Yeah.
No, they're not.
Of course they are. I think, but the point, we can't wait for permission.
Do you know how much is spent on alcohol? How much is spent on drugs? How much is spent on cigarettes? It's a sign and a proof that as long as we still have this mentality of consumerism, the people are not ready for change. Look at how productive the Somalians are, or the Bangladesh, the Ethiopians. Give them capital, they will turn it into something. They don't drink. They don't. You won't see them doing these parties. But if you come to the youth of the poor masses, they are buying champagnes, they are buying expensive clothes for the sake of seeking validation. But when you talk of productivity, there is no productivity, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I understand where you are coming from, but again, I don't think it's fair to lump everybody into a category. And secondly, these people that are selling Hong Kong clothes, they have to do it. They would rather be content marketers or call center people, but the industry of these people to so that their children can be at the station and have better opportunities than they had. That's why they're selling these things. Not because they want to subvert an agenda or serve consumerism or anything. People will do what they have to do to make sure that they get ahead, that their children get to a better station than what they were. So, I mean, I don't think that, we don't need catastrophe and a dictatorship to get to industrialize. There's plenty of dictators in Africa.
But how then do we keep people in check? Because as long as we are doing elections every 5 years, you know how the political system works. Suppose I'm a councillor of ANC, my MP is EFF, and my president is DA. Definitely the chain is lost. So we are going to have
be an amazing country. Parliament would be lit.
So I'm saying because there is no inconsistency with democracy. If there was consistency to say our councillor is maybe ANC, the MP is ANC, the president is, it will make sense. But as long as we have these variations and difference in constituency level and parliament level, I think it's difficult to have that type of change. So how do we keep people in check?
No, we need more democracy, not less. If people are given an avenue to express their grievances in a democratic forum that is really taken seriously, then I think we will. People are becoming very disillusioned with democracy. Voter turnout is going lower and lower. Okay, the last election in South Africa, people turned out because Jacob Zuma was in, and that motivated people for or against, and the child the ANC. But where there is some form of accountability, where we do have a real system of public officials, public representatives to really be held to account, not just protected by their political parties and the interests that they serve or run interference for them. Wouldn't it be amazing if one, let's say a member of parliament, reported to your constituency, and that constituency has the right to recall that member of parliament? We can't do that. We vote every 5 years and that's the end of the story. So a dictatorship would stymie that. More democracy would facilitate that, would enable that. And every now and then from time to time, we would politicians are the best of people. The worst of people with the best of intentions.
Can you take a look of some examples of socialistic environments like Cuba, Venezuela?
A huge success. Cuba
China,
is an incredible
Russia.
success.
When they turn their economies, or when they have a political shift, did they allow democracy, or they, in some way, they actually recolonize their people? Because I think by allowing democracy with the people who still have the mindset which is in colonialism, they're just going to give power to popularism instead of ideologies. Because if you see at the state of Africa today, it's about who is popular. It's not a matter of the ideas or the constitution. As long as you're popular today in Africa, you'll be the next leader. So democracy, to me, I don't think it's going to bring this type of change we want in Africa. So why rather can't we make a form of enslavement, which is what I define as dictatorship?
So the rise of populism is a failure of liberal democracy. All of these things that we were speaking about, the extraction, putting in place puppet regimes, facilitating the election of leaders who are, stupid, greedy, incompetent, corrupt. These are very useful tools for, I'll be frank, for capitalists, for white supremacists. In the case of, let's say, Cuba, for example, the assault that they are under economically, The United Nations has, on many occasions, voted to end the US blockade of Cuba. And always the United States has gone, nope, we veto that. Simply because of the fact that in the 60s, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara embarrassed the United States to such an extent that the United States machinery will never forgive and never forget that. And that level of pettiness, the Cold War is over. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended. It's done.
But
still,
do you agree that we have tried democracy now for over maybe 30 years in most African countries, and there seems to be no change? Don't you think we need to rapidly make a shift in our political approach? Because by continuing with democracy in this political system, I think
it's not a political system. It's these are economic shackles facilitated by the political illusion of consent. We vote, we consent. Our leaders can then make decisions on behalf of us. And many times the will of people are intercepted by interests that are out of our eye line, So democracy is not the problem. I think we need more democracy. But the problem is, again, the neocolonialism, instruments like the CFA franc and other shackles that are the IMF imposes austerity. Let's say if the IMF wants to institute structural reform over a country needs I forget the country. There are many of them in Africa, but I don't want to say it's one country. Country A and it's actually country B, but they suffered, as many countries did, took a massive hit in COVID-19. The economy shut down, but this particular country was very severe. The IMF then came in and said, well, we want you to stop free education. We want you to cut these subsidies. We want you to do this. We want you to effectively remove any safety net for the poor and the working class for education and assistance. And then we will give you this loan. And remember, it's a loan. So the IMF are lending money to us that was taken from us in the first place. It's macabre. That's our money that they are lending us to back and taking interest back from us and demanding that we make changes to remove the safety net from the poor, the weak, the old, the needy.
I think that's also part of my why I don't hear.
It was Ghana. It was Ghana.
It was Ghana.
Ghana, yeah.
That's why I don't believe in capitalism. That's why I'm totally against capitalism as a political system. But my approach,
we're gonna work on you. We're gonna turn you into a socialist.
My approach into transforming Africa into communism and socialism is we need that's my ideas and my approach. We need to enslave people to some degree. We need to control their movements. We need to take away some of their freedom. And
whose freedom?
People's freedom.
People.
Yeah. So the other thing, we need also to control the population.
I don't think so. I think we need more people. I think we need a bigger labor base, and I think to take advantage of the massive industrial opportunities that will come with beneficiation,
it would work
industrialization.
We are investing
we
on
more
human
people.
capital, but if we are not investing on human capital, and if the people are relying on the government, then why do we need more people to suffocate the government? Because the government will now take from its pocket to feed these people. Unless we are saying we're going to turn these humans into machines that are going to bring us some capital or some investment, then we can say we need more people. But if we are crying of service delivery in Kailicha, and we are having more kids and more babies, 10 years from now, what will be the situation?
I think
of the place?
There's plenty of space in the inner city for people in Kailicha to move into. There's this big thing called Rondebosch Common.
But who should give them that land?
I think the city of Cape Town, because the city of Cape Town owns massive parcels of land.
Agreed that to have ownership of land, you need to have some form of title deeds to the land.
I think that that the city of Cape Town, as they are doing, should hand over title deeds. Historically, It is owed to the people.
But why?
Because it's owed to them. It's our land. It's land that was held in commons. It was taken from us. It was exploited for the benefit of very few people. And with the capital that was accrued from this exploitation and this theft, unfortunately, those who benefit from that are just going to have to take a bite. They're just going to have to take a loss. Now, how we do that so that we don't end up in a situation where we have conflict and violence and even more competition and resentment, and where, in fact, speaking about South Africa, where it breaks apart, that's the riddle that we have to solve through dialogue like this.
What's your take on foreign nationals and immigrants?
They should be welcomed. They should be welcomed as our African brothers and sisters, but they should be regularly. We should know, of course, nobody can, jump through a wall or fence or drive here without having some documentation, purely from, in terms of being able to make sure that we have the resources to provide, safety and provision people with what they need, security, then that's fine. But, like my African brothers and sisters are my brothers and sisters. That's why I'm a Pan-African, because I see humanity in my brother from across the Limpopo River, in Egypt, in Africa, wherever they may be. I think ultimately I'm advocating for the same goal that would benefit, us all: sovereignty, agency for people, and, to undo the legacy of colonialism, slavery, extraction, and to grow.
But would you still want the same idea if the foreign nationals are becoming a parasite, or they are becoming a fungi that is...
That is something that should be dealt with as a matter of the rule of law. It shouldn't be in the hands of individuals to determine who is a parasite, who is a criminal, they must be subjected to due process. And due process is a thing that separates us as a civilized, progressive, constitutional democracy from the people who landed here in 1652 and just took and said, "Oh, I got a title deed, bad luck."
That's politics, yeah? So you would agree that there is not going to be a shift anytime in the political domain. And what I think South Africans can do, I think they only have two options that can change the political system and the dynamics of the political system. The first one, nothing comes on a silver platter. So the only way to take land is to pick up a gun and fight.
Not necessarily. They've been.
No, I'm saying I've got two ideas.
Okay, yes, that's the one. Okay,
as to what can be done to take land. Pick up a gun and fight. But once you pick up a gun and fight, then you should be ready to become like Zimbabwe. Because Zimbabwe pick up a gun, they fought, they take the land, but they suffered. So that's the first option. You can pick up a gun and fight, but you must be ready to face the consequences of the actions. And the second option is to let the system run as it is and let things flow as they are. But you will be subjects, you will be slaves, and you will be workers of the elites and those who control the economy. And therefore, you need to fight foreign nationals day in, day out. Because for the economy of South Africa to be where it is, or for it to function so well, it needs some cheap labor. And where does that cheap labor come from? It comes from those foreign nationals. So, so I think there's, what's her name? There's a lady called Papano Pasha. She emphasized on the scramble of cheap labor in the Southern Africa. And South Africa is this big giant in the room which needs to exploit workers from these surrounding countries. So if we allow this system to continue, then the locals should be willing to fight foreign nationals in and out, because nothing's going to change. And if they don't control the population, the level of poverty in 20 years' time will be high. Because it's cheap for poor people to raise the kids than it is for the rich in the middle class. Because there is cost of living. But if the government is paying for your life and your lifestyle, then it means that you can do it anything you want and wherever you want. So I think those are the two options that I think South Africans have, and they have to think and choose wise.
I have another option, and I have to cut this shorter because I have to. But the third option is education.
Okay.
You don't have to go to school, university to educate yourself. There are books. We spend so much time. I think it was Google stats that said 70% of all internet traffic is porn.
Okay.
Imagine if 70% of all internet traffic was academia or music or art or literature or history or something. Now I'm not saying I'm not saying that I'm not saying that we should that people should ban porn or whatever the case may be. But we have these tools at our disposal, and the tool to fight for the future, it's in literature, it's in political theory, it's in applying that political theory in our daily life. And if there's one thing that I could bring across to people, if there's one thing that I could change, is to look at your brother and your sister from the African continent and see your brother and your sister, not your competitor.
I don't think that's practical. There's
It's an aspiration.
I could say as a black person, I'm not actually safe with other black people for some reasons. I don't know why. You would agree that for me to walk in places like Khayelitsha Langa, Delft, Kugletu, I will have to keep my eyes open. But if you're walking to places like Camps Bay,
why is Camps Bay like that, and why is Khayelitsha and Delft like that? It's because
I think it's the level of criminality.
Why did the criminality come from?
Criminality comes from the people, and it is the community that is protecting criminals.
Why are they? But the criminality that happens in those areas, it is as a result of a systemic ghettoization of people. You are safe in Camps Bay because that space was made pristine on the back of colonialism and slavery and apartheid.
But don't you also
are unsafe there because there's an element of let's say Afrophobia, xenophobia, whatever the case may be. But the consequences in these areas, whereas one the fear of violence, and the other there's a possibility of being shunned or being looked funny or being reported to the neighborhood watch group. The one results in a fatality, the other one results in inconvenience. And this is because that comes from the political economy of colonialism and slavery and apartheid.
I would disagree. If you walk in Wynberg and in Claremont, the same service delivery in both towns, but different outcomes. You can clearly walk in Claremont, the city is clean. But if you go to Wynberg, the city is cleaned every day. I think they clean in the morning and they clean in the afternoon. But if you walk in Wynberg during the day, the place is dirty. If you walk in Claremont, the place is clean. What makes the difference? Can we blame colonialism and slavery for that?
I blame the DA Department of Water and Sanitation.
Why can't we blame
these guys are not doing their job? It's very easy. It's very easy, and that is something that we are actually in control of.
Should the DA control who put the papers in the bin, or should they control who should not throw litter?
No, they should provide for a bin to be put there. That's it.
I believe there are lots of bin in Wynberg. Just that people don't want to.
Yeah.
I think
I gotta go.
Cheers. I think this is the end of the show, and I feel honored to have Roscoe Palm in the studio. I come from the underprivileged, but I feel honored to have someone like you on this platform, and actually to hold in 1 hour conversation in English is something that I can be proud of. Thank you, Roscoe.
Thank you, my brother.
It's a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. We'll do this again sometime.
Sure, man. I really appreciate you. Thank you.